For 38 years, I believed I had built something most people only dream about, a real home. Not just the kind with walls and a roof, but the kind that holds you, the kind you carry inside your chest when you're away from it and feel it pull you back like gravity. My husband Raymond and I had that. We built it together from nothing, with our hands and our stubbornness, and a love that had survived more than most marriages ever have to face. And at the center of all of it, our daughter Renee, our only child, the whole reason we kept building. I want you to understand what she meant to me before I tell you what she did. Because if you don't understand that first, none of what comes after will make sense. And I need it to make sense not just to you, but to me. Even now, Renee was born in the spring, and I used to say that was fitting because she arrived the way spring does, slowly, then all at once, filling every room she entered with something that hadn't been there before. She was stubborn like her father and sharp like me, and she had this laugh that could silence a crowded room, not because it was loud, but because it was so genuine that people stopped what they were doing just to listen to it. Raymond used to say she was the best thing we ever made. He said that right up until the end. When she married Brett, I tried. I want that on the record. I tried harder than I have ever tried at anything in my life to love that man. Brett was charming in the way that certain people are charming completely and without depth, like a coat of paint over rotting wood. He smiled at the right moments and said the right things, and looked at my daughter like she was something precious. And for a long time, I told myself that was enough. Raymond liked him more than I did. Raymond always gave people the benefit of what he couldn't quite see. They had been married 6 years when Raymond died. Heart attack, sudden, the kind that doesn't give you time to say the things you need to say. I was in the kitchen making his coffee when I heard the sound. He made a sound I cannot describe and will not try. And by the time the ambulance came, he was already somewhere I couldn't follow. That was 4 years ago. I have not stopped missing him for a single day since. After Raymond died, things shifted in ways I didn't notice at the time, because grief does that. It takes up all the space in your attention so that other things can move around in the background without you seeing. The house suddenly felt too large. Renee started calling more often, visiting more often. She and Brett came for dinner on Sundays, then stayed for the weekend, then started mentioning, gently at first, that it might make more sense for me to have help managing the property. The house was paid off. Raymond had made sure of that. There was also the lake cabin in East Tennessee that we had bought together 20 years ago, 30 acres on the water. The place where we had spent every summer of Renee's childhood, the place where Raymond had taught her to fish, and where I had sat on the porch every evening watching the sun go down over the water, feeling, truly, I signed the power of attorney because my daughter asked me to, and because she was my daughter, and I trusted her the way you trust gravity. Not because you've tested it, but because it has never once let you down. The document was for practical purposes, she explained. In case something happened to me. In case I was incapacitated. Brett was a financial advisor. She reminded me. He would make sure everything was handled properly. I remember her sitting across from me at the kitchen table where Raymond and I had eaten 1,000 meals together. Her hands folded, her voice quiet and reassuring, and I remember thinking that she looked so much like him in that moment, the same set of her jaw, the same steadiness in her eyes, and I signed. That was 8 months before the weekend at the lake. The first thing I noticed, and filed away without fully understanding, was the withdrawal. Not emotional withdrawal, though, that came later, but financial. Small amounts at first, spread across accounts I had mostly stopped checking because Brett had taken over the management of them and I had trusted him to do that. Then larger amounts. Then a pattern that I could see only in retrospect. The way you can see a shape in fog, only after you've already walked through it and turned around to look back. It was my neighbor Dorothy who said something. Dorothy had known Raymond and me for 22 years, had watched Renee grow up, had a key to my house for emergencies, and the kind of plain-spoken directness that I had sometimes found abrasive, and had come to rely on completely. She had a cousin who worked at the bank, not my branch, but close enough. And one evening in early September, she sat down across from me at my kitchen table and she said, "Carol, I need to ask you something and I need you to hear it." She asked me when I had last actually looked at my account statements. I told her Brett handled all of that. She said, "That's what I was afraid of." I don't want to dwell too long on what I found when I started looking. The details are ugly and specific, and the ugliness of them still makes something tighten in my chest, in a way that has nothing to do with grief and everything to do with shame. Not my shame, exactly, but the shame of having been made a fool of by the two people I had trusted most after Raymond. There were transfers. There were accounts I hadn't opened. There was a lien on the lake cabin that I had not authorized and could not explain, and that bore my signature in a form I did not recognize as my own handwriting until a forensic examiner later told me it was a very good forgery. I did not confront them. I want to be honest about that. I found out what I found out, and I sat with it for 3 weeks, and I did not confront them. Partly because I needed time, partly because I didn't know what confronting them would mean, what it would break, what it would cost me, whether I could bear to look at my daughter's face and watch her lie to me. But mostly, if I'm being completely truthful, because some part of me was still hoping I was wrong. Some part of me was still holding the door open for an explanation that would make sense. I kept that door open longer than I should have because she was my daughter, and I had spent 63 years of my life learning that love is not a thing you can simply put down. It was Brett who called about the lake weekend. He called on a Tuesday morning, friendly and warm in that practiced way of his, and said that Renee had been stressed and that he thought it would do everyone good to spend a long weekend at the cabin, the four of us, meaning me and him, and Renee's college roommate Patsy, who had stayed close to the family over the years and who I genuinely liked. Fresh air, he said. The water, a chance to reconnect before the weather turned. He said Renee had been asking about it. I said yes. I know how that sounds now. I know exactly how it sounds. And I have sat with the sound of it in my own head every night since, turning it over, looking at it from every angle, asking myself what I was thinking. I think I was thinking about the last time Raymond and I had been there together. I think I was thinking that the cabin was still mine, still ours, in some way that no forged signature could entirely erase. I think I was hoping that if I sat across from my daughter at that familiar table with the lake behind her, something true would pass between us, something that would either break it open or hold it together, but at least settle it. I couldn't live much longer in the fog. Patsy couldn't come. She called me the day before we were supposed to leave, apologetic and slightly vague, something about a family obligation she couldn't get out of. I remember being disappointed. I remember hanging up the phone and feeling, for just a moment, a cold and formless unease that I dismissed as nerves. We arrived on Friday afternoon. The cabin was beautiful the way it always was. The old pine smell, the light coming off the water in the late afternoon, the sound of the lake moving against the dock below the porch. Renee seemed normal, which was its own kind of thing to notice. She hugged me when we arrived and helped carry bags from the car and made the kind of small talk that fills a silence without acknowledging it. And I watched her and thought, she is my daughter. She is my daughter. Whatever else is true, she is still my daughter. Brett grilled that evening. We sat on the porch and ate, and I watched the sun go down over the water, and I thought about Raymond. I thought about him the way I almost always think about him at that cabin, not with the sharp edge of the early grief, but with something quieter, a bone-deep ache that has become so familiar it almost feels like company. Saturday morning, Brett suggested a walk along the North Shore path, the one that runs along the ridge above the water, about a quarter mile above the lake at its highest point. He said the fall color was at its peak and that we should see it while we could. Renee agreed immediately, the kind of quick agreement that I recognize now for what it was. I want to describe what happened next very carefully because I have had to describe it many times to police, to attorneys, to doctors. And I have found that the more carefully I describe it, the more real it becomes to me again. And the more real it is, the less it feels like something that happened to someone else. We were on the ridge path, the three of us. Single file because the path is narrow there. And I was in the middle. Brett was ahead of me. Renee was behind. The view through the trees was extraordinary reds and golds, and the occasional deep orange of a sweet gum, and the lake below us catching the morning light. I remember thinking, despite everything, that Raymond would have loved this. I remember the specific texture of that thought, And then Brett stopped walking. He turned around on the path, and the expression on his face was one I had never seen on him before. Not the performed warmth, not the salesman's ease, something flat and deliberate and old, like a decision that had already been made a long time ago and was only now being carried out. He said, "Carol, I need you to understand that this is just business." I started to speak. I don't remember what I was going to say, because in the same moment I felt Renee's hands on my back, both of them flat, and then pushing, and the path disappeared from under my feet, and the world tilted in a way that the body understands as catastrophic before the mind has time to catch up, and I was falling. I hit a ledge about 15 feet down, which the doctors later told me almost certainly saved my life. It broke 2 of my ribs and shattered my left wrist, and opened a gash along the side of my head that bled far more dramatically than it needed to. But it also stopped my fall. I lay against the rock face with the lake far below me and the sky tilting overhead, and I was aware of 2 things at once, that I was in extraordinary pain and that I could hear voices above me. Renee's voice. "Do you think she's dead?" Brett's voice. "Don't look down, come on." A silence that lasted long enough for me to understand. They were waiting to see if I would move. I did not move. I don't know exactly how long I lay there, long enough for the voices to recede, long enough to become very cold and very certain, in a way that bypassed fear entirely and arrived at something almost calm, that if I made a sound before I was sure they were gone, I would not get a second chance. So I lay still against the rock, and I breathed as shallowly as I could, and I listened to the sound of the path above me go quiet, and then I waited 10 minutes more. Getting myself up that ridge face with 2 broken ribs and a shattered wrist and blood in my eye was the hardest thing I have done in my life, and I am not going to tell you that I wasn't afraid, because I was more afraid than I have ever been. But I have Raymond's stubbornness in me too, somewhere. And the thought of that, the thought of him, was something to hold on to when the pain tried to make me stop. A couple hiking the south path found me on the access road 40 minutes later. The man gave me his jacket. His wife called 911. I remember her holding my good hand in both of hers and talking to me in a low, steady voice to keep me conscious, and I remember thinking that the kindness of strangers is one of the things that keeps you believing in the world, even after the people who should have loved you have shown you what they're capable of. Renee and Brett were still at the cabin when the police arrived. Brett's car was in the drive. I have thought about that many times since, the fact that they didn't run, or didn't run far enough, or perhaps believed that a 63-year-old woman with a head wound wasn't going to make it off that ridge. The investigating officer told me later that Brett had seemed genuinely surprised. That was the word she used, genuinely. I will not linger on the legal proceedings except to say that the financial fraud alone was substantial enough to ensure that neither of them will enjoy the life they had been planning. The assault charges added considerably to that. I testified. I told the truth plainly and completely, and without embellishment, because the truth, as I had lived it, required no embellishment. But the truth I told in that courtroom was not the hardest truth of that year, not even close. 2 weeks after the arrest, Dorothy came to see me at the hospital. She sat in the chair beside my bed, and she held both my hands in hers, and she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something careful and pained and older than her years, and she said, "Carol, there's something I should have told you before any of this happened, and I need you to hear it now." Dorothy had known, not about the ridge. She had not known they intended to harm me, but she had known about the money. Her cousin at the bank had told her things that had alarmed her, she said, months before she had come to me with her questions. She had sat with what she knew for a long time before she spoke, telling herself she might be misreading it, telling herself it wasn't her place, telling herself the banking relationship was confidential and her cousin could get in trouble. She had waited, and in waiting, she had given them 8 more months. I looked at my friend of 22 years across the hospital room, and I tried to find the right thing to feel. I was too tired for anger, too emptied out for anything sharp. What I felt, sitting there with my wrist in a cast and my ribs taped and Dorothy's hands around mine, was a kind of sorrow, I don't have a precise word for the particular sorrow of understanding that even the people who love you are sometimes not brave enough to save you. She asked me if I could forgive her. I told her I didn't know yet. That was the truth. And I gave it to her because she deserved the truth even when the truth wasn't easy. Some days, I think I have. Some days I wake up at 4 in the morning and lie in the dark and feel the weight of those 8 months, everything that could have been prevented, everything that could have been different. And I think about Dorothy sitting with what she knew while the money disappeared, and the plan was laid, and the weekend was arranged, and the forgiveness I thought I had does not feel quite as settled as it did the day before. That is the thing nobody tells you about betrayal. It is not a single event. It is a season. It lasts far longer than the thing that caused it, and it comes back in weather you didn't predict. And sometimes it brings with it not just the original wound, but every wound that came before it, because the heart does not sort its damage neatly by date. Renee's sentencing was in January. I did not attend. My attorney said I could give a victim impact statement, and I wrote one, and then I could not make myself read it aloud in a room where she would be sitting, where I would have to look at her face and find her there, my daughter, the spring child, the one who had her father's jaw and her father's steadiness. I submitted the statement in writing. The judge read it into the record. I have not spoken to Renee since the arrest. I do not know if I ever will. That is a sentence I have said in my head perhaps 1,000 times. And it still does not feel entirely real. Not because I haven't accepted what she did, but because accepting what someone did and accepting that the person you knew is gone are two different processes, and they do not always move at the same speed. The cabin is still mine. That much was settled. The fraudulent lien was voided. The forged documents nullified. My attorney is one of the finest people I have ever met, and she had a very particular satisfaction in her voice the day she called to tell me it was done. I sat on the phone in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had signed the power of attorney, and I cried not from relief exactly, but from some complicated mixture of relief and grief and something else I couldn't name, something that felt like the end of a very long and exhausting argument. I went back to the cabin in the spring. I drove up alone on a Thursday morning, and I opened all the windows and I sat on the porch for a long time looking at the lake. The water was that particular shade of green-gray it gets in early April before the summer color comes in, and the air smelled like pine and cold and everything new. A great blue heron stood at the end of the dock for nearly 20 minutes, absolutely still, watching the water with that ancient patience that herons have, and I sat watching it and thought about Raymond, and about the life we had built and the way it had held, and the ways it had not. I am 63 years old, and I have been loved by a good man, and I have lost him, and I have been betrayed by my child and survived it, and I am still here on this porch looking at this water, and some days that feels like enough. Some days it feels like almost everything. What I know now that I did not know before is this. Love is not the same thing as safety. You can love someone all the way to the marrow of your bones, and that love will not protect you from what they choose to do. And conversely, this is the part that took me longer to understand: what they chose to do does not undo what you felt. The love I had for the daughter I raised is not made false by the woman she became. It is just made heartbroken. I think about the girl who had that laugh. I think about Sunday mornings when she was small, the weight of her on my lap, the specific warmth of a child who trusts you completely. I think about Raymond watching her cross the stage at her college graduation, the way he looked at me across the crowd with that smile, the private one, the one he saved for moments that were too full for words. I cannot stop loving the daughter I raised. I have tried, and I cannot. And I have come to believe that the inability to stop loving someone who has hurt you is not weakness. It is just the shape grief takes when it is wearing the face of someone you made. I sit on the porch of this cabin that is still mine, and the heron lifts from the dock on enormous wings, and the lake catches the light, and I breathe in and breathe out, and I am still here. That will have to be enough for now.